Ah, come here, kid, sit by my side. Under this old torchlight, I'm going to pull a story from the endless sea of history just for you. Once upon a time, in distant lands, there was no king, no kingdom, just endless wars, feuding lords, and a hopeless people. But then, out of that chaos, a light emerged, a ruler who carried justice and honor like a sword. And that was the day Camelot was born. But Camelot wasn't just any city. It wasn't just stone walls and golden rooftops. No. Camelot was an ideal. A place where power was balanced by justice, where virtue was sharper than any blade. That's why its story is worth telling, and its legacy worth remembering. Today, I'll tell you about the birth of Camelot, its glory and its rise. You'll learn about the golden age of the kingdom, how the Round Table came to be, and why Arthur's name was etched into legend. So, if you're ready, let's dive into the tale, because history is a whisper that refuses to be forgotten, and we are here to listen. Ah, kid, come closer and listen well. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about stone walls, golden towers, or grand thrones. This is the story of a dream. The first step of a king who didn't just want to unite lands, he wanted to unite people, hearts, and hopes. Arthur rose above a Britain torn apart by war, betrayal, and division. Back then, the land wasn't whole. Every lord ruled from his own castle, every knight carried his own banner, and every people were left to their own fate. The chaos that followed Rome's fall had seeped into Britain's very soul, and the people had long forgotten what justice even looked like. And so, in the midst of this despair, Arthur decided to lay the first stones of but a kingdom could not be built by the sword alone. A true ruler had to lift the spirit and hope of his people. When Arthur took the throne, he knew one thing: if he wanted to unite Britain under one banner, he needed more than just a capital. He needed a symbol, a place built not just from stone, but from an idea. And that's how Camelot was born. According to legend, Arthur spent long nights speaking with Merlin, listening to ancient prophecies, hearing the whispers of old wisdom, and shaping the dream in his heart. He didn't just want to build a city of stone. He wanted to create a home for justice, honor, and virtue. And so the foundations of Camelot were laid. The finest stonemasons, the most skilled carpenters, and the wisest engineers were summoned. The city was built by the riverside in the heart of fertile lands, making it both well-protected and prosperous. With its towering spires reaching for the sky and its golden-roofed halls shining like a beacon, Camelot stood as a symbol of hope. But its true strength wasn't in its walls. It was in the ideals that were forged within them. Camelot wasn't meant to be just another royal stronghold. No, Arthur wanted it to be a place where virtue, not kings, would rule. A place where justice was stronger than any sword, where words held more power than bloodshed. But of course, no great dream comes without challenges. The foundations of Camelot had been set, but turning it into a true legend would take much more. Who would stand by Arthur's side? Which friends would remain loyal, and which enemies would rise to threaten his kingdom? Ah, kid, those are stories for another time. Ah, kid. Now, close your eyes and imagine. Right in front of you stands a magnificent city, its towering spires reaching for the sky, its golden rooftops gleaming under the sunlight. To a traveler passing by, Camelot might seem like nothing more than stone walls and grand gates. But the moment you step inside, you can feel it. This is the heart of a kingdom. Not just a place of swords and thrones, but a place where an ideal was brought to life. Come, let me take you on a journey through Camelot's narrow streets, vast squares, and majestic halls. First, turn your eyes toward the palace, the very symbol of its greatness. King Arthur's throne wasn't just a seat of power, it was a symbol of justice. The grand hall, surrounded by massive stone walls, was the heart of the palace. This was where knights gathered, where decisions that shaped the fate of the kingdom were made. And in the center of it all stood something the world had never seen before: the Round Table. Ah, what a brilliant idea it was. It had no head and no end. Whoever sat at it was equal to the rest. It was here that Arthur's most loyal friends, his bravest warriors, and his most just companions came together. But Camelot wasn't just a place for warriors. Knowledge and art thrived here too. The great libraries, halls where scholars debated, rooms dedicated to magicians and wise men. Somewhere in these halls, Merlin sat poring over ancient books, unraveling the secrets of old wisdom. The sounds that echoed through the palace walls weren't just the clash of swords, but the verses of poetry, the rhythm of epic tales, and the words of wisdom passed down through generations. And just beyond the palace stood one of Camelot's most sacred places, the temple. It was here that knights prayed, swore their oaths, and purified their souls before battle. The prayers spoken in these halls weren't just offered to God, but to the very spirit of Camelot itself. Because this city was more than just a home for its people. It was a place where they served a greater purpose. But of course, every great light casts a shadow. As Camelot's walls rose higher, so did the number of those who wished to see them fall. The threats to Arthur's kingdom didn't always come from invading armies. Sometimes, the greatest betrayals came from within. So, how would this mighty kingdom stand against the challenges ahead? Ah, kid, now that is a story worth telling another time. Ah, kid, now close your eyes and listen closely. Imagine you're a king. You have power in your hands, a people who bow before you, and hundreds of knights at your command. But does true strength come only from the sharpness of a sword? Does a great king rule by the weight of his crown, or by the mark he leaves on the hearts of his people? This was the question that haunted Arthur's mind, and the answer to it became the inspiration for one of Camelot's greatest symbols, the Round Table. Back then, Britain was still drowning in chaos. It was a time when the strong crushed the weak, and justice was nothing more than the blade of a sword. But Arthur dreamed of something different. He didn't just want a band of warriors clashing steel. He wanted a brotherhood that held honor and justice as their shield. But how? What force could bring knights together as equals and curb their greed? That's when Merlin told him an old tale of ancient rulers who sought counsel at a table where no man sat above another. A table with no head and no end. Arthur fell in love with the idea. Word was sent to the finest craftsmen. The strongest trees were cut. The most skilled hands worked to shape the table that would become the heart of Camelot. And then the day came. The Round Table was placed in the great hall. It had no beginning, no end. Whoever sat there, whether born to nobility or raised as a commoner, was equal. A king was no higher than his men, and the youngest knight was no lesser than the oldest warrior. At this table, Arthur's knights would be judged not by their swords, but by their minds and hearts. When the first meeting was held, silence filled the hall. Many knights were uneasy, seeing the old hierarchy crumble before their eyes. To them, a king was meant to sit above all others. A lord was meant to lead from the front. But Arthur walked around the table, looking each of them in the eye, and said, "This table will show that none of us stand above the rest. We will fight together, we will decide together, and we will be brothers." That day, the very soul of Camelot was forged. These knights would not just be warriors, they would be the champions of justice and loyalty. But kid, as beautiful as the idea of equality is, the human heart is never so simple. The Round Table became one of Camelot's greatest strengths, but it also carried the seeds of its greatest trials. How long could this sacred brotherhood last? And when would the shadow of betrayal fall upon them? But that, my friend, is a story for another time. My friend, now close your eyes and travel back with me all the way to the golden age of Camelot. The knights, at the first light of dawn, would arm themselves with swords, don their armor, and ride out on horseback to renew their oaths for the kingdom. But being a knight wasn't just about wielding a sword well. Do you know what separated a warrior from an ordinary soldier? Honor, loyalty, courage. That was the true power surrounding King Arthur's Round Table. Knighthood wasn't just a title. It was a way of life. And the Knights of Camelot were the noblest of those who walked that path. Arthur wanted to rule his kingdom not just with conquests, but with a sense of order and morality. He knew that for victories won on the battlefield to last, it was not swords but principles that should reign. That's why the sacred rules were established for everyone sitting around the round table. A knight would not lie, would not oppress the weak, would always stand for justice, and most importantly, would remain loyal to his people and his kingdom. Above all else, power meant responsibility. Courage wasn't just shown in battle, but in speaking the truth as well. Legend has it, when Arthur declared these laws, the knights looked at one another. Some had grown up in the brutality and savagery of endless wars. Now they were expected to show mercy to their enemies, protect the weak, and even keep their swords sheathed when necessary. For many, this was a harder trial than donning armor, because true courage wasn't just knowing when to fight, but knowing when to hold back and when to retreat. This code of knighthood solidified the foundation of Camelot. The warriors who swore their oaths around the round table weren't just loyal to King Arthur. They also swore loyalty to each other and to the people they served. Being honorable in battle, accepting a fight only when needed, keeping their word, these principles turned the Knights of Camelot into legends. But of course, every light has its shadow, right, kid? The ideals of Camelot were high, but the human heart is weak. So, how long did this great order last? Did the knights truly stay loyal? Well, that's where the hardest part of the story begins. Ah, Guinevere. Her name is etched in history not only for her beauty, but also for her intelligence and fateful decisions. It would be a great mistake to see her as just a queen, for Guinevere was the soul of Camelot. She was not just a wife sitting by Arthur's side, but a figure woven into the fabric of the kingdom. Even centuries later, her name is remembered with the echoes of both love and betrayal. But first, let's talk about Guinevere in Camelot's golden age. Imagine the moment Arthur first saw her son. A king who had returned victorious from great wars, who had brought his people together. Her heart was strong enough to support a whole kingdom, yet she was also lonely. When he met Guinevere, he felt, perhaps for the first time, the presence of something beyond the victories won on the battlefield. Her intelligence, grace, and unwavering will brought Arthur's kingdom to a new dimension. Being the wife of a monarch was not just about wearing fancy dresses or walking around the palace gardens. Guinevere was a woman who won the love of the people, who could speak at the same table with lords and knights. Her words were words that not only Arthur, but even the most powerful men of Camelot took into consideration. Do you know what made a palace as powerful as a monarch's throne? It was not just the sword and the army, but also art, music, literature, and justice. Guinevere was the person who brought this spirit to Camelot. The poets and bards she supported made Arthur's reign legendary. The feasts she organized made Camelot not just a castle, but a center of civilization. Her kindness and nobility strengthened the people's loyalty to their king. A kingdom is not won only on the battlefield. When a palace governed by justice can be the hope of the people, then a true golden age is experienced. But the wise know that the brighter the light of a story, the sharper its shadow. Guinevere's influence on Camelot was undeniable, but like everyone who could not control their heart, her destiny would be put to a difficult test. She was a powerful queen, but she was also a person who acted with her heart. So, what winds would sweep that heart away? How would Guinevere's love, loyalty, and betrayal change the fate of Camelot? The answers to these questions are hidden in the most difficult parts of the story. Ah, Merlin. Even the mention of his name carries a whisper on the winds. Echoes of the past reach the ear. He was not just a wizard. He was a wisdom that came from beyond time. Everyone says that Arthur founded his kingdom with his sword, but the wise know that behind every great king there is a mentor who guides him. Merlin was not just an advisor, he was a weaver of destiny. He was a man who could see what ordinary people could not, who could hear the prophecies echoing in the depths of time. And that was Arthur's greatest luck, to have met the right wisdom at the right time. Some think that Merlin existed only through magic. However, his greatest power was not magic, but knowledge. His was a wisdom that read the language of nature, listened to the whisper of the stars, and reflected the mistakes of the past as light for the future. When Arthur was still a child, Merlin was the one who prepared him for the day he would become king. His education was shaped not only by sword fighting, but also by how to use the mind and the heart. Because a ruler would rule not only by fighting, but also by making the right decisions. Merlin helped Arthur gain this awareness. They say that Merlin could not only see the future, but also knew how to weave the threads of fate. His words would sometimes ring like a prophecy, and sometimes they would wander in people's minds like a riddle. But do you know what his biggest secret was? He never intervened directly in events. He only showed the way. He would often tell Arthur, "You must forge your own path. I will only show you the light." That's why Arthur would consult Merlin's wisdom for every big decision, but he would make the decisions himself. Because a true king does not follow his own shadow, he paves his own path. But fate never progresses in a straight line. As time went by, the burden on Arthur's shoulders increased. Camelot grew. The bonds between the knights grew stronger, but at the same time, fractures began. What about Merlin? Had he foreseen all this? Did he see Arthur's victory or destruction in his prophecies? And most importantly, was there a fate that even the wizard could not change? The answers to these questions were hidden in the shadows of the future. Excalibur. It was more than a sword, more than a legend. It was a legacy. Its steel was not forged just to cut down enemies. Its brilliance was not just to reflect the light of the sun. Excalibur was a power forged by fate itself, not by blood but by right. And Arthur, he had to prove whether he was the true owner of that sword. Long ago, the wars between the kings of Britain had been endless. The kingdom was torn apart, each lord claiming his own. And in the midst of this chaos, a sword embedded in a rock emerged. Buried deep in the cold gray stone, this sword was known as a weapon that no ordinary warrior could pull, but only a worthy king. Merlin's prophecies had spread like whispers among the people. He who pulls this sword from the stone is the rightful king of Britain, and this word caused greedy lords, power-hungry warriors, and the mightiest knights to rush to that rock one by one. Each one trusted their hands, each one believed they were strong enough, but none of them could move Excalibur even an inch. Then one day, a young man stepped towards that rock. It was Arthur. Until that day, no one had promised him a kingdom, no one had told him he would sit on the throne. But there was something inside him, courage, justice, and most importantly, the noble spirit he carried in his heart. When Arthur placed his hands on Excalibur's hilt, the sword felt lighter, as if it had been waiting for him for years. The stone cracked like a giant waking from a century of sleep, and Excalibur was lifted into the sky in all its glory. At that moment, the steel of the sword met the sun and emitted a dazzling light. The people knelt in amazement, for now they knew the true king had finally arrived. But Excalibur's power was not just a physical weapon. It was a symbol of Arthur's rule. His sword was not only for cutting down enemies, but for ensuring justice. And indeed, under the glow of Excalibur, Camelot rose. It was not just a city, it was an ideal. The rules of the Round Table were as clear as Excalibur's edge: equality, loyalty, and honor. And so Arthur carried Excalibur not just as a weapon of war, but as a reminder of his promise to his people. But like all great power, Excalibur came at a price. No matter how sacred a weapon, the greater the responsibility it placed on the shoulders of its bearer. Arthur knew his sword would bring him victory, but what about betrayal? What about loss? Could Excalibur truly make Camelot an eternal kingdom? Or would this sacred weapon be the key that sealed Arthur's fate? Ah, Camelot. It wasn't just stones, towers, and walls. It wasn't a kingdom conquered by swords alone, but ruled by reason. Arthur knew that a ruler must stand tall, not only on the battlefield, but also at the head of the scales of justice. For the sword may win a kingdom, but justice is what will protect it. In Arthur's reign, there was a great hall rising at the heart of Camelot, the Hall of Justice. There, everyone from the common peasant to the most powerful knight was considered equal. No one was privileged because of their noble birth, and no one could gain more than their fair share through their power. Arthur believed that everyone had a say in the Hall of Justice, as in the Round Table. But how would justice be provided? How could the kingdom live in peace without a legal system that people could trust? This was the question that occupied Arthur's mind the most. Laws were written to ensure order throughout the kingdom. These laws were shaped by ancient traditions and Merlin's wisdom. A peasant who stole would be judged not only for his crime but also for his circumstances. If someone stole out of hunger, Arthur would not only punish him, but would also question why his people were starving. The voice of a man who was wrongly accused was heard as loudly as that of a lord. Laws were established so that witnesses could be heard and both sides could present a fair defense. Judges were chosen not only for their loyalty to the king, but also for their reputation for honesty. But Arthur's greatest distinction lay in the fact that he applied justice not only according to written laws, but also according to his conscience. One day, an old woman was brought to the courthouse. Her crime was trespassing on one of the Lord's lands. The poor woman's defense was simple. I only wanted to gather a few grains for my sick son. The Lord was angry and demanded that the woman be punished. At that moment, Arthur thought long and hard. If the woman was found guilty, then the law would prevail. But would that be fair? That day, Arthur decided that the law should serve the people, and that people should not be blindly subjected to the law. The woman was forgiven for her crime, and her family was given food from Camelot's warehouses. But the Lord was not forgotten. He was reminded that he should look after his people better. Camelot was strong not only with its walls, but with its sense of justice. The people saw that Arthur was a king, not only with his sword, but also with his conscience. But the greatest test of justice was yet to come. But when Arthur was tested by those closest to him, could the scales of the court truly remain in balance? Ah, talking about the golden age of Camelot makes one forget how time flies. In those years, there was peace and plenty in every corner of the kingdom. The fields were fertile, the forests were full, the people sang joyfully. Arthur was not only a ruler in the glory days of Camelot, but also the protector of his people. The greatness of his kingdom was measured not only by its magnificent stone structures, but also by the trust in the hearts of the people. Camelot had become a symbol of justice, goodness, and prosperity. But of course, it was not easy to reach this peak. Behind every victory, every success, there was a struggle, a story. Under Arthur's rule, Camelot shone like a star. Everyone was in need, and Arthur never left his people alone. The fields were more fertile, the fishermen brought abundant catches from the sea, and the merchants walked the roads with joy, and the wealth and greatness of Camelot astonished all the surrounding kingdoms. Under Arthur's rule, the people not only felt secure, every individual in society had value. No one was considered superior by birth or land. In Camelot, no one rejoiced in the absence of another. Everyone shared peace and prosperity together. Prosperity and peace brought not only material wealth, but also spiritual wealth. In the palaces and villages of Camelot, people of all ages could find a friend to lean on and a mind to confide in. At the heart of the kingdom was a friendship that was born not only of Arthur's leadership, but also of the deep respect that the knights of the Round Table had for each other. The people of Camelot were connected like a river. Everyone shared the same purpose, and were united by the same values. Everyone was somehow captivated by the loyalty and devotion they felt for each other. Arguments were resolved in tolerance. free of hatred, and every peasant, every craftsman, and every knight lived in a heartfelt trust. Camelot was a place of magic. Neither the gold of the palace nor the stone walls were real. The real value was the trust and loyalty people gave to each other. No matter which village they were from, if a villager raised his head and smiled and said Arthur's name, everyone who heard this name would feel a warmth, because Arthur was the symbol of justice and peace. Another beauty of the Golden Age was the cultural richness of Camelot. A feast was held every evening in the palace, and famous poets and musicians would perform works for the people. Knights would improve themselves not only in war, but also in literature and art, and they would look for a meaning in every work of art there. Camelot, where all this beauty came together, worked in harmony like a magnificent orchestra. However, every piece of music would sometimes leave an echo like the tone of a sudden cello. Camelot's golden age was so powerful that everyone thought this peace and prosperity would last forever. But life, as always, no matter how bright it was, would one day encounter darkness. Camelot's bright days, or perhaps this golden age, were the sign that something was coming to an end. So, what caused this perfect order to start shaking? Would we witness the dark shadows that would slowly replace the peace of Camelot? Ah, Lancelot. His name is that of a legendary hero who was a constant in Camelot's glory days. Think about it. Once upon a time, that young knight dedicated himself to Arthur with a deep loyalty and a desire to serve Camelot. Lancelot's rise was not just one man's heroic journey. It was also a tangible symbol of Camelot's ideals and values. He was the greatest knight, but he was also Camelot's pride and most precious jewel. He helped Camelot reach its peak not only with his sword, but also with his courage, honor, and determination. Lancelot's heroism was measured not only by the bravery he showed in battle, but also by his nobility in every situation he found himself in. He always strived to increase the glory of Camelot in the way he knew was right. As the greatest of knights, he showed the world what justice and honor meant. But no one, perhaps not even Lancelot himself, had predicted that his journey, created by his lofty ideals and devotion, would lead to a darker place. He won many victories, fought countless enemies he could have killed, but always returned to Camelot. Arthur, the leader of the knights, always trusted him, because Lancelot's loyalty was like Camelot's most precious treasure. But this great hero's deepest pain and conflict always remained hidden. His heroism, however, at some point turned into threats to Camelot's innocence and justice. After each victory, the dark shadow inside him grew a little bigger. Unfortunately, Camelot's greatest knight sometimes had to fight his greatest battle within himself. The most striking feature in Lancelot's story was his unwavering devotion to Arthur. This devotion to Arthur gave him the duty to protect Camelot, to glorify it, and to never deviate from the truth. But his inner self, his inner desires, and the pain he experienced began to pull him to a very different place. Most of the time, the struggle in the knight's heart clashed with his love for Camelot and his loyalty to it. Sometimes Lancelot protected Camelot, and sometimes he paid the price for this protection. And this price caused him deep wounds, not only in the external wars, but in all the human relationships he was in. At first, the people of Camelot saw Lancelot only as a hero, but over time, the wars in that hero's heart could not be hidden from the public eye. Lancelot's failures, tragedies, and most importantly, his inner conflicts overshadowed even the brightest star of Camelot's golden age. This hero would unexpectedly face another war, a more complex enemy. This was not a physical war, but a spiritual war. And that war, which would change the fate of Camelot, would be much more devastating than some had predicted. But will Lancelot's deep loyalty to Camelot give him the courage to confront the darkness within himself? Or, worse yet, will the fall of Camelot's greatest knight lead to the fall of Camelot itself? Ah, those were the days, my friends. The glorious times of Camelot, the era of legendary heroes, unforgettable victories, and that magical atmosphere that enveloped hearts. Once upon a time, there was a kingdom where justice was on every stone and courage was in every corner. Arthur, that noble king, had managed to turn Camelot into an ideal. But as you know, there is always a burden. Every victory has a price. Every light has a shadow. While Camelot was in its golden age, its brightest period, there were also weaknesses hidden behind this glory. Lancelot, Guinevere, Merlin, and of course Arthur. The lives of each of them tell the sacrifices required to build a great kingdom, but they also give deep clues about the dark corners of the human soul. But the path to the fall of Camelot was not actually limited to the story of a single person. It is truly heartbreaking to see how this ideal, that everyone once dreamed of and carried as a hope within them, collapsed and was broken. Here today, as we follow the traces of these ancient times, we try to understand the legacy created by this great kingdom. The truth is that the story of Camelot was not only a lost kingdom, but also a reflection of a man's struggle with hardships, sacrifices, betrayals, and ultimately with himself. And now I ask you, was the glory of Camelot really just a dream, or will that ideal one day be reborn?